Hi, my name's Kendrix. I used to believe family meant protection. But mine? They nearly carved me open while smiling in my face. They called me selfish for hesitating to hand over a kidney to my brother. They said I was ungrateful, unloving, less of a man. But the truth, they planned it, lied, laughed behind my back. They brought papers to my door. They dragged me into that hospital. I almost signed my life away until a single recording exposed everything. Now ask yourself, what would you do if the people who raised you were the same ones trying to destroy you? I heard it before I felt it. The thunderous slam of my father's hand against the wooden dining table sent a jolt straight through my spine. The forks clattered. My glass of tea jumped. Silence swallowed the room like a cold fog rolling in from nowhere. "You have to save your brother," Dad barked, his voice slicing through the air. I didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared at the mashed potatoes on my plate, now shaking slightly like they too had heard the command. This wasn't a conversation. It was a decree. Across the table, Aldrich, the golden child, the sick one, the always excused, sat with his arms crossed, pale but proud. My older brother had always known how to be the center of attention, even without saying a word. Mom, Alara, leaned forward, face already damp. "Kendrix," she said, her voice cracking in all the practice places. "How can you be so ungrateful? Your brother is dying." Ungrateful. There it was. The label they kept on a shelf, ready to slap on me whenever I paused long enough to think for myself. I looked at her through the steam of the roast. Her mascara had started to streak, but her words came out smooth, rehearsed, like she'd been waiting to use them. "This isn't fair," I said quietly. Dad narrowed his eyes, not hearing or not caring. "I raised you better than this," Mom added. "You're his brother. Flesh and blood, and I was the spare part, the backup plan." I glanced down the length of the table, 9 seats, each carefully set. I was at the end, near the dim corner, where the ceiling light barely reached. My napkin sat half-folded beside a chipped plate, like always. My place, my role. I didn't miss the way Celine, Aldrich's wife, leaned back with that familiar curl of her lip. "What kind of man," she said slowly, "hesitates over his brother's life?" Her voice was cold, not dramatic, not angry, just cold, like the AC unit buzzing above the fridge. She didn't care if I said yes or no. She just wanted to watch me squirm. I remembered being 8, shoved aside at Aldrich's birthday party, my gift pushed under the table to make room for his new bike. I remembered scraping ice off his windshield every winter morning during college while he slept in. They always said we were family, but family, in this house, was a ranking, and I was the last rung. I could feel the napkin twisting in my hand, tight, tighter. Like if I squeezed hard enough, it would hold me in place. "Why me?" I asked. I didn't mean it loud. It came out like breath, like habit. Dad leaned forward, his voice calm now, too calm. "Because you're the only match, and because you owe this family something." Oh, that word hit deeper than the slam of his hand, like I'd taken something and needed to give it back. Like all my years of showing up, keeping quiet, staying small, that debt never counted. I wanted to say no. I wanted to stand up, throw the chair back, tell them they could go to hell. But I sat. The fear wasn't about the surgery. It was the same fear I'd known since I was old enough to have thoughts of my own, that if I ever pushed back, I'd be cut out completely. And somewhere in me, some small part still wanted to be seen. The room stayed quiet, except for the hum of the fridge and the soft clink of someone setting down a glass. My father stood. His plate was still full. He stared at me like I was nothing more than a disappointment dressed in clean clothes. Then he said it, flat and final. "You will do this, or you are no son of mine." I didn't eat a bite the rest of that night. After the table cleared and the storm of their expectations passed, I drove home with a silence so thick it pressed against my chest. My apartment greeted me the same way it always did, dim, quiet, and far too honest. I sat on the edge of the bed without taking my shoes off. I kept hearing my father's voice. Not the words, but the weight behind them. Not a request, a verdict. I lay awake that night, my father's words pounding louder than my heartbeat. The ceiling fan above me spun slow and steady, but each rotation felt like a blade slicing through the stillness. I watched it long enough that my eyes blurred, and the shadows of the blades began to feel like memories. The kind you try not to remember. Dad yelling in the backyard when I was 10, telling me to toughen up after I scraped my knee on the gravel. Mom saying your brother wouldn't have cried. The birthday when Aldrich got a new watch and I got socks, then a lecture about gratitude. Every silence I swallowed, every nod I gave just to keep peace. Back then, I thought being quiet made me good. Now, I see it just made me useful. The sun was still trying to crawl over the buildings when the knock came. 3 sharp taps, too early to be anyone but family. I opened the door to see my mother standing there, bundled in a light sweater, even though the morning was already warm. Her eyes were red, her makeup uneven, and in her hand was a neatly folded handkerchief that looked too clean. "Kendrix," she whispered, voice cracking in that way she knew softened me. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. She walked in like she owned the place. Didn't ask, didn't wait. Just moved straight to the small dining table and sat down. "I couldn't sleep," she said, smoothing the front of her blouse. "This family is falling apart. And it's killing me." I stayed standing, arms crossed. She looked up at me with wet eyes, but when she dabbed them, the handkerchief came away dry. "You're our only hope now," she added. "I just don't understand how you can be so cold." Cold. That was rich coming from the woman who used warmth as a bargaining chip. "Don't you care that your brother might die?" She pushed. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, looked at the way her voice rose and fell like a stage actress. Then, as if rehearsed, came the final line. "After all this family has done for you." I almost laughed. Before I could respond, the door knocked again, louder this time. Dad stepped in without waiting for an invitation. Behind him, Celine followed, holding a manila folder like it was her trophy. "We brought the paperwork," he said. "No hello, no how are you, just straight to business." Celine placed the folder on the table with a quiet tap, then looked at me with that same smug tilt of her head. "Everything's ready," she said. "Just needs your signature." She sat down across from me. Mom poured a glass of water from the jug I keep in the fridge. She set it in front of me like I was a guest in my own home. "Here, sweetheart," she said softly. "You need to stay hydrated. It's just a signature, that's all." I didn't touch it. The folder sat between us like a threat. I opened it slowly. Consent form, waiver, pre-op schedule, all printed, clean, official. I picked up the pen. My hand trembled. Mom sniffed beside me, wringing her handkerchief again. Dad paced near the window, arms behind his back like he was waiting for a report. Celine leaned closer, her perfume sharp and artificial. "You'll sign it," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "Men who hesitate aren't real men." My hand shook, the pen's tip hovering over the dotted line. The pen slipped from between my fingers, landing softly on the table with a dull clink. It rolled once, then stopped against the manila folder like it knew better than to keep going. I froze, and in that moment, memories from years ago rushed back like a flood I couldn't stop. It wasn't just about Aldrich. It wasn't just about the surgery. It was about decades of standing in the corner of my own life while everyone else took center stage. Suddenly, I wasn't sitting at my kitchen table anymore. I was 10 again, knees knocking against the leg of the kids' table during Thanksgiving at our old house in Michigan. I could still smell the stuffing, feel the draft from the window behind me. Aldrich, 16 then, sat at the head of the adult table. Dad carved the turkey while he bragged about Aldrich's GPA, his football scholarship prospects, how he was going places. Mom smiled like she'd won the lottery. And me, I had brought home a certificate from school. Perfect attendance. I thought they'd be proud. I remember waiting for the right moment to show them. I remember trying to speak up, raising my hand like I was still in class. But the moment never came. When I finally opened my mouth, Dad reached for the wine. Mom turned and said, "Don't embarrass yourself, Kendrix. Sit quietly." So I did. I sat. I folded the certificate back into my lap, then into my pocket. That crumpled piece of paper stayed there until it went through the wash days later. No one ever saw it. No one ever asked. That's when I learned something crucial. In our family, silence was safer than being seen. I blinked and the kitchen light above me buzzed back into focus. The ghost of my younger self retreated, but not before leaving behind the weight of all the other times I'd been made invisible. I looked around the table. Mom was still dabbing at her cheek with the same dry handkerchief. Dad stood with his arms folded, jaw clenched. And Celine wore that same damn smirk like she was watching her favorite show and I was just the next episode. The air in the room felt heavier than it should, like the walls were leaning in, listening, waiting. I swallowed down the heat rising in my chest. Every cell in my body screamed to say something, anything. But instead, I did the smallest thing I could do that still felt like mine. I pushed the folder back across the table. Celine's smirk twitched, just for a second. "Not now," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake either. Mom gasped like I'd cursed in church. "Kendrix, no," I said again. "Not tonight." Dad stepped forward, palm flat on the table. "This isn't a negotiation. Your brother needs you." I met his eyes. For once, I didn't look away. Then he should have thought about that before treating me like a spare part my entire life. The words hung in the air like smoke. Celine let out a soft chuckle, low and sharp. What did I say? He doesn't have the guts. She didn't even bother to hide it. She enjoyed this. Dad opened his mouth, but Mom cut him off with a whisper so sharp it made the hair on my arms stand up. "If you don't sign tonight, you'll regret it tomorrow." There it was. Not a plea, a warning, a threat wrapped in motherly guilt. A curse, really. The kind you can't wash off once it sticks. I looked at her, really looked at her, not as my mother, just a woman who knew how to use sorrow as a weapon. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in years, not for real. I stood slowly. The chair scraped the floor louder than I expected. "I need time," I said. "That's the one thing Aldrich doesn't have," Dad growled. "Then maybe," I replied, "you should have started valuing mine sooner." No one moved. No one spoke. I walked to the door, opened it, and held it wide. It was clear. They didn't leave right away. There was a beat, a long, pregnant pause. I could feel the calculations behind their silence. And eventually Celine rose first. She collected the folder, tucking it back under her arm like a failed contract. She brushed past me with a whisper, low enough for only me to hear. "You think you've got time? They'll take it from you if they have to." Dad walked out next. Not a glance. Just the heavy steps of someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth looking at. Mom followed last. She paused in the doorway, looked back with eyes that pretended to beg but only judged. Her words lingered in my ears like a curse I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep. I just lay there on the couch, staring at the ceiling, watching the paint crack in that familiar spot above the kitchen archway. Her words stuck in my chest like a thorn I couldn't dig out. "If you don't sign tonight, you'll regret it tomorrow." She didn't say it like a mother. She said it like someone who'd already made arrangements. Like someone certain the punishment was coming, no matter how I tried to avoid it. Morning light had just started slipping through the blinds when the pounding began. The next morning I woke to pounding at my door, and their threats had arrived early. 3 heavy knocks, then a pause, then again, louder, faster. I dragged myself up, slipped on yesterday's sweatshirt, and cracked the door open just enough to see Merrick standing there like he owned the place. Celine beside him, arms folded, a smirk already loaded on her face. Behind them were 2 cousins I barely recognized, Robert and Keith, guys I hadn't seen since Grandpa's funeral 15 years ago. Merrick didn't wait for an invitation. He shoved a thick envelope toward me. "Hospital's waiting," he said, like he was telling me a bus schedule. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I didn't reach for it. My hand stayed on the edge of the door. "You brought backup?" I asked, nodding toward the cousins. "What's next? You gonna carry me in?" Celine's voice was sweet and sour all at once. "We thought it might be easier if the whole family helped. Encourage you." Before I could respond, I heard another set of footsteps, softer, slower. Mom. She was climbing the last step of the porch, wearing the same coat from last night and a look that tried to pass as concern. "Ilara," I said flatly. She stepped forward and reached for my arm. "Baby, please, it's time. Your brother doesn't have days to wait." I could have shut the door. I wanted to. But guilt, It's got a funny way of cracking the lock. I stepped back just enough for them to see it meant fine, but not welcome. I need to get dressed, I said. They waited in the hallway. I changed slowly, partly because I needed to breathe, partly because I was buying time to decide what the hell I was walking into. An hour later, I was sitting at Merrick's dining table. Again the guest, never the host. The house was clean, the kind of clean that didn't feel lived in, the kind you paid someone else to maintain. Merrick laid out folders, medical charts, and printouts across the polished wood like a salesman. Across from me sat Alara, dabbing at the corner of her eye with a tissue that hadn't touched a real tear in a decade. Celine sat just far enough to look uninvolved, but close enough to jump in if needed. "You're compatible," Merrick said, tapping one of the pages. "Perfect match. Doctor says it's a textbook case. All you gotta do is sign. Get it scheduled. Keep things moving." I looked down at the charts but didn't read them. I didn't have to. "You've had time to think," Mom said, voice cracking just enough to sell the part. "Your brother's counting on you." Celine leaned in, smile curling like smoke. A real man wouldn't hesitate. That hit different. The way she said it, like she'd been rehearsing it, saving it for just the right moment. And I saw it clearly now. This wasn't desperation, it was orchestration. I glanced around the room. On the wall behind Merrick, every one of his awards was framed and lit like museum pieces. His college diploma, his business plaque, even that damn varsity football photo where he held a trophy bigger than my self-worth. There was nothing of mine. Not a single trace I'd ever existed in this house. Not even in childhood. A memory stabbed its way in. Me, 11 years old, holding that perfect attendance certificate in this very room. Dad glanced at it once, then said, "Not everyone needs a trophy for showing up." I remembered folding it into my back pocket, like trash. I came back to the present just in time to hear Merrick say, "This is your duty. He's your brother." I said, "Not now," I replied, firmer than before. "Did you hear me? Or are we pretending I don't speak English?" The room fell silent for half a beat. Then Merrick laughed, not from the gut, but from the throat, sharp and cold. "Still playing the victim," he said, shaking his head. "You always knew how to make everything about you." Celine chuckled along, just enough to sting. Alara looked away. Merrick leaned across the table, eyes locked on mine. "You don't sign today, you're done. No calls, no invites, no place at this table. You'll be cut off from everything and everyone." It was supposed to scare me. Instead, something shifted. I sat there, gripping the edge of the chair, feeling my jaw clench so tight it ached. And for the first time, I wondered, maybe being cut off was exactly what I needed. His threat wasn't just words. It was a knife to everything I'd endured in silence for decades. That night, I sat alone, wondering if losing my family was worse than losing myself. The living room was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old floorboards. I hadn't turned on the lights. Darkness felt more honest. I stared at the envelope still lying on my kitchen table. The edges had started to curl, as if even paper wanted to escape the pressure written inside it. Merrick's words echoed louder in the silence than they had when he spat them at me across his dining table. "If you won't sign today, I'll make sure you're cut off from this family. Completely." I sat on the couch, elbows on my knees, hands clasped tight as if I were in prayer. But no prayer came. Just questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Am I really selfish? Was I the weak one Dad always accused me of being? Or was I finally learning to breathe? I thought back to high school, junior year. We were at a family reunion up in Lansing, and someone had asked Dad what each of us kids planned to do after graduation. Merrick had said law school, which earned him a hearty slap on the back. I'd said I was thinking about teaching. Dad didn't even look up from his plate. "He's still deciding," was all he said, like I wasn't even sitting there. Later that night, I'd overheard him talking to Uncle Tim in the garage. "Kendrix, he's soft, always been the weak one, not cut out for real work." I'd held that in my chest for decades like a splinter too deep to pull. Now, staring at that envelope on my table, I felt the old wound flare again. I didn't sleep, just dozed in and out, the kind of rest where your mind never shuts off. Around 6, I took a cold shower, pulled on a clean shirt, and made coffee I didn't touch. At 8:15 sharp, my phone buzzed. "Merrick, hospital consult today. Be there at 9:30. I didn't reply, but I went. Maybe I needed to see how far they were willing to push this. By the time I walked through the hospital's sliding doors, the air already smelled like antiseptic and too much control. Cold. Artificial. Just like them. A receptionist checked my name and directed me to a private consultation room. The moment I stepped in, I knew it wasn't a consultation. It was a trap. Merrick was already seated at the long table, his suit jacket hung neatly over the back of his chair like he had a job interview afterward. Celine sat beside him, crossing one leg over the other, her eyes gleaming like she was watching a game she knew she'd win. Alara sat near the end, clutching her purse in her lap like it held her last piece of dignity. She nodded weakly at me. I didn't nod back. Across the table, a doctor I'd never met stood up and offered a hand. "Mr. Rains, Dr. Colburn, just here to answer any questions. Questions." The stack of papers already waiting in front of my chair didn't leave much room for questions. I took the seat, but didn't touch anything. Dr. Colburn cleared his throat. "You're a perfect match, Mr. Rains. We're talking high compatibility, minimal risk. I've reviewed your labs personally. If we move forward, we could schedule the procedure within a week." Merrick leaned in. "See? No complications. Clean and easy." I didn't look at him. I was still scanning the paperwork when Alara's voice trembled beside me. "Just sign, Kendrix. Do it for your brother. For the family." I kept my gaze on the table. "And if I don't?" The silence that followed was sharper than anything they'd said out loud. Celine broke it with a whisper that stung more than a shout. "Then you'll prove you were never part of this family to begin with." I turned to her. Her expression was so smooth, so pleased, it almost made me laugh. Almost. Then the nurse walked in, quietly, and placed a glass of water in front of me, crystal clear, ice clinking, same kind of glass as the one Mom had set down at my apartment just days before. And just like then, I didn't drink it. I stared at the ripples, felt my throat dry, but couldn't bring myself to lift the glass. Even water feels poisoned when it comes from their hands. Dr. Colburn slid a pen across the table. "Take your time, but the sooner we get confirmation, the better." I picked up the pen. It felt heavier than it should have. I glanced at Alara. Her eyes pleaded behind watery lashes. I looked at Merrick, stone-faced, already seeing this as a done deal. And then at Celine, calm, calculating, cruel. I took a slow breath and set the pen down, but this time gently with control. "If I sign," I said, voice steady, "it'll be on my terms, not yours." The room froze like I'd flipped the thermostat to 0. Dr. Colburn blinked. Alara stopped dabbing her eyes. Merrick's jaw tightened, but it was Celine's expression that changed the most. She didn't smirk. She didn't speak. For once, they were all quiet. My words froze the room, but I knew this battle was far from over. I stood up slowly, ignoring the chair legs scraping behind me. My hand, the one that had held the pen a minute ago, tingled, like it had carried a weight heavier than ink and paper. I walked out of that consultation room without another glance, not at Alara's tear-drenched eyes or Merrick's clenched fists. But I didn't get far. The next move came faster than I expected. Merrick wasn't about to let me have the last word. Barely 10 minutes had passed. I had made it to the hospital's waiting area, weaving through quiet bodies and the distant beep of machines, when his voice pierced the air. "Kendrix!" I turned, and there he was, storming toward me, Celine right behind him. The double doors hadn't even stopped swinging shut before they exploded into a full-blown performance. "You're killing me, Kendrix," Merrick's voice boomed. "You'll be the reason I die." Conversations around us halted, heads turned. A woman holding a toddler pressed her lips together and shuffled a step away from the commotion. Celine stepped up beside Merrick, folding her arms, voice dripping with venom masked in disbelief. "I don't understand how someone can be this cold to their own blood. What kind of man hesitates to save his brother?" Someone coughed. Another murmured something under their breath. The shame they tried to drape over me spread like wildfire, and it burned. But I didn't react. Not a twitch. Not a word. Because I knew the game now. If I screamed, I'd lose. If I broke down, I'd be confirming every lie they told about me. So I stood there, hands at my sides, eyes fixed on Celine's face like it was a mirror I no longer recognized. She blinked first, I walked away. I made it to the glass doors of the main entrance, but they followed. Of course they did. Outside, the September air hit my skin like cold truth. The hospital's parking lot shimmered in the afternoon sun, the heat rising in waves from the asphalt, but my chest felt colder than it should have. Merrick grabbed my arm just before I reached my car. I turned, slowly. He shoved me, not hard but firm enough that I stumbled back into the hood. His hand pressed against my chest like he needed to feel my heart to know it was real. "You sign," he hissed, "or I swear I'll ruin you. I'll go to the press. I'll tell everyone you're a heartless coward who let his brother rot on a transplant list." I looked into his eyes, and for the first time in years, I saw the desperation behind the rage, not fear for his health, fear of losing control. I leaned closer. "Then do it." He blinked. Celine stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching like a director waiting for the next scene. Merrick dropped the envelope he had tucked under his arm. It hit the ground with a soft slap. Then he shoved a pen into my chest. "Do the right thing, for once." The words were sharp, but my silence was sharper. I didn't take the pen. I didn't pick up the papers. I stepped back. The forms lay on the asphalt, page corners fluttering in the wind, a crumpled echo of the certificate they'd once thrown away. That teenage version of me, the one who used to cry quietly when they forgot my birthday, might have bent down and signed right there, just to stop the shouting. But not this version. Not now. Celine stepped forward, her heels clicking like punctuation. She picked up the papers, brushed them off, then looked at Merrick. "Don't worry," she said loud enough for me to hear. "He'll sign. We'll make sure of it." Her eyes locked on mine. There was no warmth there, no humanity, just calculation. They turned and walked off together, heads held high like they'd won something. But I stayed there, watching those pages sway in the breeze, feeling something unfamiliar curl up inside me. Not anger, not fear. Power. Quiet, but real. The papers blew across the asphalt, but I knew the real storm was only beginning. And I didn't chase them. I stood there, hands in my pockets, watching the wind scatter them like ash from a fire I no longer intended to put out. My breath was steady. My heart wasn't. That night, I realized silence alone wouldn't save me. I needed proof, and I needed it fast. I was back at my apartment, sitting at the kitchen table. The overhead light flickered like it couldn't decide whether to help or torment me. The crumpled consent forms Merrick had thrown at me now lay on the table, stained with a coffee ring and smudged footprints. I hadn't thrown them away, not yet. They were evidence, not of legality, but of pressure, of manipulation. I kept replaying Celine's voice in my head, mocking, smug, the kind of arrogance that always came from someone who thought they were untouchable. And maybe she had been, for years. But arrogance makes people sloppy. I remembered the times she used to brag over wine in their sunroom, sipping from those tall glasses like they made her royalty. "People only see what you let them," she once said, not knowing I was in the hallway, half-shadowed. "Control the story, and you don't have to tell the truth." Back then, I'd rolled my eyes. Now I sat straighter. If she was that comfortable talking, maybe she'd slip again. I opened my laptop and searched for something simple, small, legal. 15 minutes later, I was walking out of a nearby electronics store with a voice recorder tucked in the inner pocket of my coat. It was no bigger than a pen cap. Sleek. Quiet. I got home and tested it. My voice came through scratchy, but clear enough to be admissible. That was all I needed. The next morning I put on my old brown jacket, the one with the ripped lining, and drove to the hospital. No call ahead, no text. I just walked in and waited. The lobby was quiet. A kid sneezed in the corner, his mother distracted by her phone. Somewhere down the corridor, a voice called for a code blue. I ignored it. 10 minutes passed, then 15, and then I saw them. Merrick and Celine huddled in the corner of the waiting area, facing away from me. I stayed by the vending machines, pretending to read the back of a granola bar, one hand pressing the recorder through the lining. "She's getting impatient," Celine said, her voice lower but not low enough. Merrick muttered something I couldn't hear. Then Celine laughed, quiet, but vicious. Once we get his kidney, the deal is done. He won't even know what hit him. He's too soft. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I just stood there, breathing through my nose, eyes on the carpet. The recorder buzzed once, signaling it had picked up something loud enough. A nurse walked over with a small tray, plastic cups, papers, a clipboard, and set a glass of water on the table between them. Again. Same scene, new script. I stared at the glass from where I stood. It rippled slightly when Celine shifted in her chair. I didn't know if it was from her movement or just the weight of her presence. Water doesn't lie. People do. I stepped forward slowly, making sure my footsteps were soft. I walked past them, gave the slightest nod, and didn't stop. Not when Celine glanced up, not when Merrick turned his head like he'd smelled something rotting. They said nothing to me. I said nothing to them. In the elevator, I leaned back against the cold metal wall and closed my eyes. I won't fight with words anymore, I thought. I'll let their own words destroy them. That evening, after a quick dinner I barely touched, I sat on my couch in the dark, just the screen of my laptop casting a blue glow over the room. I pressed play. The sound was fuzzy at first, background noise, someone coughing, but then came the voice I'd memorized. Celine. Once we get his kidney, the deal is done. Then her laughter, sharp, confident. The kind of laugh you only give when you think the world is on your side. I exhaled. The recorder felt heavier than it should have, like it had taken the weight of months, even years, off my chest and compressed it into a single moment. I held it in both hands. This is enough to end them. Celine's voice echoed in the dark room, proof sharp as a blade in my hand. I sat there for a long time listening to it over and over. Not because I needed to, it was burned into memory after the first playback, but because I needed to believe it was real, that I wasn't losing my mind, that this wasn't some fever dream of betrayal. By the time dawn painted the blinds with pale gold, I'd made my decision. The next morning, I walked into the hospital ready, not to sign, but to expose. I'd barely slept. A shower couldn't wash away the tension that wrapped around my ribs like wire, but my mind was clear, cold even. I knew what I had to do, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't hesitate. As I stepped through the main doors, the air smelled of disinfectant and fresh coffee. Familiar. False. I took the elevator up to the surgical prep floor where everything had started to spiral weeks ago. The hallway outside the consultation room buzzed with activity. Nurses walked by with clipboards, patients shuffled past in wheelchairs, but I didn't see any of it. They were already there. Merrick sat in a wheelchair in the corner, draped in a light hospital blanket, his face pale but still smug. Celine stood beside him, arms folded tight, eyes tracking my every move. My parents were seated together on one side of the room, Dad stone-faced, Mom clutching a tissue she hadn't used yet. The table was set, literally. The consent forms were there again. A fresh pen lay neatly beside them, like an invitation, or a trap. "Glad you finally showed," Merrick said, his voice raspier than usual. "Let's stop the games." Alara stepped forward before I could answer. Her eyes were red. She gripped my hand hard enough that it hurt. "Please," she whispered. "He doesn't have much time. Don't let your brother die, Kendrix. Please." I didn't pull my hand away. I didn't speak either. My father cleared his throat. "We raised you better than this." Celine, of course, couldn't resist. "Or maybe you're just proving what we've all suspected. You were never really part of this family." I looked at her then, really looked. That smirk. It wasn't just cruel, it was certain. She thought she had me boxed in, cornered like always. Merrick slammed his hand on the table. "Sign, now." Two cousins, second cousins technically, but still thick enough in the drama, moved closer to the door, arms crossed, blocking the exit like hired muscle. It was a performance. They thought this was the final act. I reached forward slowly. My hand hovered over the pen. I could hear Alara's breath catch beside me. I picked it up. Then I signed the first line. Smooth. Calm. The room exhaled. Then, just as Merrick leaned forward to grab the paper, I tore it in half. Gasps. Everyone froze. The tear echoed louder than I thought possible, splitting the air like lightning. And I wasn't done. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the recorder, set it on the table, pressed play. Celine's voice filled the room. "Once we get his kidney, the deal is done." Her laughter followed, sharp, smug, poisonous. Then silence. Even the background hospital noise seemed to disappear. Nurses paused. A doctor looked in through the open door. The surgeon standing near Merrick, someone I hadn't even noticed before, stepped forward. "What is that?" he asked, voice clipped. "That," I said, eyes still locked on Celine, "is my sister-in-law explaining this whole thing was a setup." Celine's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Merrick stood, wavering slightly. "That's fake. That's not her voice." I didn't move. The surgeon raised a hand. "This operation is suspended, indefinitely, until this is sorted." Alara slumped back into her chair, covering her mouth. "What have we done?" Dad looked at the floor. Mom just stared at the recorder, her face a blank wall. Maybe she was replaying all the times she'd called me selfish, ungrateful. Maybe not. Merrick's face went red. He started to lunge forward, but Celine grabbed his arm. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I met her eyes. "No," I said quietly. "I think this time, you will." They stood there, locked in a pose they didn't expect, exposed, stripped of the illusion, caught. I took a step back. My chest felt tight, not from fear, but release. I had nothing more to say. Then Celine leaned in close enough that I felt her breath on my ear. "Not yet," she whispered. "This isn't over." Her words hissed in my ear like venom, promising this fight wasn't finished. She backed away with Merrick clinging to her arm, trying to regain control of the moment, but the mask had cracked. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I saw it. Fear in her eyes. I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because I knew how people like Celine operated. When cornered, they struck harder. I stepped out of that consultation room into the hallway, the recorder still in my hand. My nephew met me there. He didn't say much, just gave a slow nod. He'd stayed behind, keeping the cops updated, making sure everything was lined up. He was young, but in that moment I realized he'd grown into a man I could be proud of. We didn't wait long. When the cops showed up at the hospital doors, I knew the end had finally arrived. Two uniformed officers walked through the entrance with calm precision, their presence silencing the buzz of nurses and visitors around them. My nephew led the way, holding his phone up like a torch in the dark. The tension shifted the second Celine saw the badges. Her confidence didn't just falter, it shattered. Merrick stood quickly from his chair, stumbling slightly. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to put himself between them and his wife. The taller of the two officers held up a hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Merrick Harmon, we'd like to ask you both a few questions." "Is this about the surgery?" Celine asked, voice pitched higher than usual. "It's a misunderstanding. This is all—" "We've reviewed an audio recording," the second officer interrupted, holding up a device. "It clearly references premeditated fraud and coercion." Celine's head snapped toward me. "You recorded me?" "No," I said evenly. "You exposed yourself." I just pressed play. She moved like she was going to lunge at me, but Merrick grabbed her wrist. His face was pale, sweating. "This is insane," he said, voice shaking. "You can't arrest her. She didn't do anything illegal." The officer didn't blink. "Actually, sir, she did. And coercing a medical procedure, that's not only illegal, it's cruel." Celine's voice cracked as she pointed at me. "He's lying. He set me up. He wants attention, money, revenge, whatever sob story he's telling you, it's fake." The taller cop stayed calm. "We have her voice, her words, her laugh. That's not fake." Merrick tried again, his voice weak now. "He's our brother." And that's when Alara broke. She dropped into the nearest chair, sobbing. Loud, broken cries. "Stop it. Please stop it. This is all too much. We're family." I turned to her slowly. For a moment, I almost let the past soften me. But I'd already learned. The people closest to you can still be the ones who destroy you. Family doesn't trick you into giving up your body, I said quietly. Family doesn't corner you into silence. One of the officers approached Celine with cuffs. Ma'am, you're being detained for questioning in connection to medical fraud and coercion. You have the right to remain silent. She shrieked and kicked the chair near her as they turned her around, snapping the cuffs in place. Merrick tried to intervene again, but this time, the second officer stepped between them. This doesn't have to get worse, he warned. Let it go. Celine looked over her shoulder as they guided her out. You'll pay for this, she spat at me. You think you won? I didn't answer, but my silence must have said enough. The hallway fell still as the doors closed behind them. Merrick stood there, mouth hanging open, eyes unfocused. Alara didn't lift her head from her hands. My father, standing against the wall, turned his face away. My mother just stared at the floor like the tiles might offer some salvation. And then, just before I left, a quiet voice broke the silence. It was the surgeon. He stepped forward, removing his gloves slowly, eyes meeting mine. You did the right thing, he said. You saved more than just yourself today. I nodded once. Then I walked away. That night, back at my apartment, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't answer my phone. I just moved around the space slowly, like I was reintroducing myself to peace. I hung my jacket, tossed the recorder in a drawer, kicked off my shoes. Everything felt unfamiliar, yet lighter. In the kitchen, I reached for the glass, the same one that had sat untouched for days, weeks maybe. I filled it with water, cold, clear. I stared at it for a moment. Then I drank. The first real sip in what felt like a lifetime. And for once, it didn't taste poisoned. I took the glass with me to the couch, set it on the table, and leaned back. Through the window, the city moved on. Cars, lights, the occasional siren in the distance. The world didn't stop just because mine had flipped upside down. But inside me, there was quiet. Not empty, not numb, just still. Silence had been my prison for decades, I whispered aloud to no one, then smiled faintly. Tonight, it became my weapon. Would you have stayed silent or would you have spoken, even if it meant losing everything?